Blessed is the one who subscribes to this channel. Remember the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated.
Welcome to Spirituality in Society.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty unexpected.
Oh.
How early Christians viewed their gatherings.
Okay.
Yeah, you might be surprised to learn it wasn't quite the same as what we see in churches today.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're diving into research that challenges some common assumptions about worship in the early church.
Yeah.
Based on Tom Wadsworth's exploration of New Testament assemblies.
Yeah, you're saying
Yeah.
they didn't have worship services as we know them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wadsworth highlights what he calls the worship anomaly.
Okay.
Essentially, the New Testament doesn't use typical worship terminology.
Right.
Words like worship service,
Right.
house of worship,
Right.
or even worship itself
Yeah.
to describe what was happening when early Christians got together.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Didn't they sing hymns and pray? And
Yeah.
what did they think they were doing?
That's the question that has fascinated scholars for decades.
Wow.
And what's amazing is how long this observation has been around. It's not some fringe theory.
Right.
Big names in New Testament studies have been pointing this out for years.
Okay.
For instance, back in 1952, scholar Gard Dilling noted that the New Testament is strangely silent on the external framework of early Christian gatherings. No mentions of symbols, no instructions on arranging the room.
Wow.
It's all about the people and their interactions.
So, if it wasn't about worship,
Right.
what was the driving force behind these gatherings?
The sources point to edification,
Okay.
building each other up, strengthening one another in their faith, encouraging spiritual growth. A lot of what we might call horizontal activity, teaching, exhorting, and supporting each other,
Right.
rather than just a vertical focus on God.
You know how sometimes church can feel more like a performance than a genuine encounter?
Yeah,
Well, this research suggests that early Christian gatherings were much more about the community working together
yeah,
towards spiritual growth.
precisely. And to really grasp this,
Yeah.
it helps to picture the setting.
Okay.
Forget grand cathedrals. Early Christians met in homes, not elaborate structures.
Right.
Imagine a more casual, intimate, and interactive setting.
That makes sense. It's hard to picture a worship service in someone's living room.
Right.
But if the focus is on building each other up,
Yeah,
that setting suddenly feels much more natural.
exactly. And here's where the terminology gets tricky.
Okay.
Using the term worship when studying early Christian gatherings can lead to anachronism.
Anachronism.
That's when we project our modern ideas onto the past.
Okay.
It's like trying to understand ancient Roman politics through the lens of 21st century democracy.
I see.
It just doesn't translate accurately.
Okay, I get it. We can't assume that the word worship meant the same thing to them as it does to us now.
Right.
But does that mean they weren't, in their own way, worshiping God through their actions?
That's a great question, and one that deserves more exploration. What's important to understand is that the sources suggest a different model for understanding these gatherings.
Okay.
Wadsworth calls it an edification model. In this model, the building itself is merely functional.
Right.
The meeting is focused on building each other up, and the people are constantly maturing through mutual support.
That's a powerful image. So, instead of the building being holy, the service beautiful, and the worshipers reverent,
Right.
it's about the community working together towards spiritual growth.
Yeah.
That raises an interesting question for you. Which model resonates more with your experience of faith communities?
It certainly makes you think, and this worship anomaly, as Wadsworth terms it,
Right.
has been noticed by a surprising number of scholars.
Oh, wow.
Even back in 1959, Edward Schweitzer, a renowned New Testament scholar, observed that terms like sacrifice, offering, and even worship are surprisingly absent when the New Testament talks about Christian gatherings.
It's fascinating how scholars across different denominations and time periods have stumbled upon the same realization,
Yeah.
almost as if the text itself is saying, hey, pay attention, you've missed something important.
And in 1985,
Okay.
Howard Marshall, a leading evangelical scholar,
Yeah.
summed it up beautifully when he said, worship is not an umbrella term for what goes on when Christians gather together.
Wow.
That's quite a statement from someone considered a pillar of the evangelical community.
Yeah. You've given us a lot to think about, but before we get too deep into the theological weeds,
Right.
I'm curious about how this edification model actually played out in practice. What do these gatherings actually look like?
That's where we really start to see the contrast with our modern conceptions of church.
Okay.
Remember, these were gatherings in homes with a focus on horizontal interaction.
So not exactly a spotlight and a microphone situation then.
Not quite. Think more along the lines of a lively discussion group with everyone actively participating. And that's where the real meat of Wadsworth's research comes in, unpacking the specific activities that made up these gatherings and how they contributed to this idea of edification.
This is where I always love our deep dives.
Yeah.
Getting past the abstract concepts and into the nitty-gritty details, it makes history come alive, you know?
Absolutely. And trust me, the details in this case are anything but boring.
Okay.
We're talking about a radical reimagining of what it means to be a community of faith.
No.
And understanding those details can offer some powerful insights
Right.
for how we might approach our own gatherings today.
Okay, then let's dive in. What were some of the specific activities that characterized these early Christian gatherings?
Well, remember that key verse from 1 Corinthians 14
Yeah.
that Wadsworth keeps coming back to?
Okay.
All things are to be done for edification.
Right.
That's how we need to understand these activities.
Right, so not just anything goes. There's a purpose,
Yeah.
a goal in mind.
Exactly.
But what did that look like? Were there like organized activities or was it more spontaneous?
It seems to have been a mix of both.
Okay.
There were certainly elements of structure and order.
Right.
Remember, these gatherings were happening in homes, not massive auditoriums, so some organization was needed.
Right.
But within that structure,
Okay.
there was room for spontaneity and participation.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure.
What's one activity that really embodies this edification model?
Take mutual exhortation.
Okay.
This wasn't about one person preaching to the crowd.
Right.
It was about members of the community
Yeah.
sharing insights, challenges, and encouragement with each other.
So instead of passively listening to a sermon, everyone was actively involved in spiritual growth.
Exactly. And think about the impact of that.
Yeah.
You're not just receiving information.
Right.
You're contributing your own experiences and perspectives, which helps others to grow.
Okay.
Creates a dynamic back and forth within the community.
I can see how that would foster a much deeper sense of connection and belonging.
Right.
It's like everyone has a stake in the spiritual well-being of the group.
That shared responsibility is key to the edification model.
Okay.
It's not about relying on a single leader to dispense wisdom from on high.
Right.
It's about recognizing the value and potential for growth within each member.
This makes me think about how we often say going to church.
Yeah.
It implies a passivity, almost like going to a show.
Right.
But this idea of mutual exhortation suggests something much more active
Yeah.
and participatory.
And that's a really important point.
Okay.
The very language we use shapes our understanding. If we talk about attending a service,
Right.
it reinforces the idea of being an audience member, not an active participant.
Okay, so mutual exhortation is one example.
Right.
What were some other activities?
Teaching, for one.
Okay.
But this wasn't limited to formal lectures. It could involve sharing personal experiences, offering interpretations of scripture,
Yeah.
or even debating theological points.
So a lot less top-down instruction and a lot more collaborative learning than...
Precisely. And remember, all this happened during a shared meal,
Oh, wow.
further emphasizing community and fellowship. It wasn't about rushing in, listening to a sermon, and rushing out.
Right.
It was about spending time together, breaking bread,
Yeah.
and having meaningful conversations that nourished both body and soul.
That sounds like a totally different way of experiencing a faith community.
Yeah.
Did everyone participate equally, or were there still designated leaders?
The sources suggest a blend of leadership and participation. While there were individuals recognized for their wisdom and knowledge,
Right?
the emphasis was on mutual edification.
Okay.
Everyone was encouraged to contribute, share their insights,
Yeah.
and challenge each other's thinking.
It's like a collective journey of spiritual discovery with everyone supporting each other along the way.
Yeah.
But did this approach ever lead to chaos or disagreement?
Oh, sure.
If everyone is weighing in,
Yeah,
surely there were times when people didn't see eye to eye.
absolutely. And that's where orderly participation comes in.
Okay.
Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians,
Right.
specifically addresses the need for structure and respect. It wasn't about suppressing different viewpoints, but about creating a space where those viewpoints could be shared
Right.
and debated constructively.
So it wasn't just about expressing yourself,
Yeah.
it was about expressing yourself in a way that contributed to the overall goal of edification.
Exactly. And that required self-awareness and consideration for others.
Yeah.
It was about speaking truth,
Right.
but speaking it in love,
Right.
as Paul often emphasized.
Okay.
This, I think, is one of the most challenging aspects of this model for us to grasp today. We live in a culture that often prioritizes individual expression above all else.
Right.
But the edification model calls for a balance
Right.
between individual voice and communal harmony.
It's like a dance almost.
Yeah.
Finding that sweet spot where everyone feels heard and respected while contributing to the growth of the community.
And that dance, I believe, is at the heart of what it means to be a truly edifying community of faith.
So we've talked about mutual exhortation teaching and this idea of orderly participation.
Right.
What other activities played a significant role?
Well, singing was certainly a part of it,
Okay.
but not in the way we might imagine. It wasn't about performing for an audience
Right.
or creating a polished musical experience.
Right.
It was about expressing shared beliefs and emotions through song,
Okay.
often spontaneously and from the heart.
So less concert and more communal expression of faith?
Exactly, and the same goes for prayer.
Okay.
It wasn't about reciting memorized verses
Right.
or trying to impress God with eloquent language.
Right.
It was about pouring out your heart to God, both individually and as a community, sharing your joys, your sorrows, and your deepest longings.
It sounds like there was a rawness and authenticity to these gatherings
Yeah,
that we often miss in our more formalized settings today.
I think you've hit on something important there.
Yeah.
It gets to the heart of what Wadsworth is trying to highlight
Yeah.
with this worship anomaly.
Okay.
It's not about saying that our modern expressions of faith are wrong or invalid.
Right.
It's about recognizing that the early church offers us a different model,
Yeah.
a different way of understanding what it means to come together
Right.
as a community of faith.
And that model, with its emphasis on edification, horizontal relationships, and active participation, might hold valuable lessons for us today,
Absolutely.
especially as we navigate a world that often feels fragmented and isolated.
It's a powerful reminder that faith is not something we experience in isolation. It's something we live out in community, supporting and encouraging each other along the way.
This has been incredibly insightful.
Good.
But before we wrap up, I want to come back to this idea of the worship anomaly.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier that there were actually 2 passages in the New Testament
Yeah.
that use worship language in the context of gatherings.
Right.
Can you tell us more about those?
Of course, it's important to acknowledge that the term worship does appear,
Right.
but the context is crucial. One instance is in Acts 2.42,
Okay.
which describes the early believers devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers.
So a very specific set of actions.
Right.
Not necessarily what we typically associate with a worship service.
Exactly. It's more about the overall way of life. These believers were embracing rather than a designated time or ritual.
What about the other instance?
The second instance is in 1 Corinthians 11,
Okay.
where Paul addresses issues related to the Lord's Supper. Here the focus is on ensuring that the celebration of communion reflects a proper understanding of Christ's sacrifice.
So again, not about performing a ritual for God's benefit, but about aligning our actions with the core beliefs of our faith.
Precisely. And these 2 instances, while using the language of worship,
Right.
actually reinforce the edification model we've been discussing.
Okay.
It's not about outward show or empty rituals.
Right.
It's about aligning our actions, our gatherings, and our entire way of life with the transformative power of the gospel.
This raises an important question. If the early church didn't have worship services as we know them,
Right.
and their gatherings were primarily focused on mutual edification,
Yeah.
then what does that mean for us today? How can we apply these insights to our own faith communities?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And one that each individual and community must grapple with in their own context. But I think the first step is simply becoming aware of this alternative model,
Right.
this different way of understanding what it means to come together as a community of faith.
So it's less about trying to replicate exactly what they did,
Right.
and more about allowing their example to challenge our assumptions
Yeah.
and inspire us to think more deeply about how we gather and why.
Absolutely. And perhaps by rediscovering this emphasis on mutual edification, we can begin to create faith communities
Yeah,
that are less about performance and more about genuine spiritual growth.
right.
Less about passive consumption and more about active participation. Less about individualism and more about shared responsibility for each other's well-being.
It's a beautiful vision and one that feels both ancient and urgently needed in our modern world.
Indeed. And it's a vision that invites us all to ask ourselves,
Yeah.
how can we in our own unique contexts
Right.
create gatherings that truly edify, that build each other up,
Right.
and that reflect the radical love and grace at the heart of the gospel?
That's a question worth pondering, and one that I hope our listeners will continue to explore long after this deep dive is over.
Yeah.
But before we let you go,
Okay.
there's one more fascinating detail that Wadsworth uncovers in his research.
Wow.
Something that adds another layer of complexity to this whole question of how the early church understood its gatherings.
Okay.
You're talking about the surprising connection
Right.
between early Christian gatherings and, wait for it,
Okay.
first century synagogues.
Oh, wow.
You're telling me there's a link between these radical, home-based gatherings of early Christians and the established religious institutions of their day.
Right.
That's unexpected, to say the least.
It's a connection you won't want to miss,
Okay.
and one that sheds even more light on the unique nature of these early Christian gatherings. But to unpack that fascinating connection,
Yeah.
you'll have to join us for part 3 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the deep dive. As promised, we're about to unravel a surprising connection
Yeah.
that adds yet another layer to our understanding of early Christian gatherings.
It's a connection that might seem counterintuitive at first, especially given our modern understanding of these institutions.
Right?
But remember, we're talking about a very specific historical context. The first century,
Right.
a time when both Christianity and Judaism were evolving
Right.
in dynamic ways.
Okay, so set the stage for us. What was the religious landscape like back then?
Okay.
And how did synagogues fit into the picture?
Well, for Jews in the first century, the temple in Jerusalem was still the central place of worship. It's where sacrifices were offered, festivals were celebrated, and the presence of God was believed to be most powerfully manifest.
Right.
But with Jewish communities scattered throughout the Roman Empire,
Yeah.
synagogues emerged as local gathering places for prayer study and communal support.
So synagogues were like satellite locations serving the needs of those who couldn't make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem.
Exactly, and this is where things get interesting.
Okay.
Wadsworth discovered that just as the New Testament doesn't apply typical worship terminology to Christian gatherings,
Right.
neither did first century Jews use that language to describe what happened in synagogues.
Now that's a fascinating parallel.
Yeah.
It's like both groups were intentionally distancing themselves from the idea of temple worship and forging their own unique paths.
Precisely. And this parallel deepens when we consider the activities that took place in synagogues.
Okay.
Much like those early Christian gatherings we've been discussing,
Right.
synagogues were centers for teaching, discussion, and mutual encouragement.
Right.
They were places where the scriptures were read, debated, and applied to everyday life.
So less about formal rituals and more about communal learning and engagement with sacred texts.
Exactly. And this emphasis on study and discussion aligns perfectly with that edification model we've been talking about.
Right.
It suggests that for both early Christians and their Jewish contemporaries,
Yeah.
these gatherings were all about growth, understanding, and applying faith to daily life.
It's like they were both redefining what it meant to be a community of faith,
Right.
moving away from the spectacle of temple worship and towards something more intimate, participatory,
Yeah.
and focused on personal transformation.
And that shift is what makes this connection so significant. It suggests that early Christians weren't simply inventing a whole new way of being religious.
Right.
They were drawing on existing traditions and practices, adapting them
Okay.
to fit their understanding of Christ and his message.
So instead of a radical break between Judaism and Christianity, we're seeing a more nuanced relationship,
Right.
one of both continuity and innovation.
Yeah.
It's like they were building on their Jewish heritage while also creating something entirely new.
That's a much more accurate and compelling way to understand the emergence of Christianity in the first century.
Okay.
It wasn't a sudden eruption,
Right.
but a gradual unfolding rooted in Jewish tradition, yet branching out in unexpected and transformative ways.
This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive.
Good.
We've gone from questioning our assumptions about early Christian gatherings
Right.
to uncovering the surprising connection with first century synagogues.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I have to ask,
Okay.
what does this all mean for us today? How can we in the 21st century connect with this ancient model of edification and communal growth?
That's the question that lingers, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a simple answer.
Right.
But I believe these insights challenge us to look beyond our inherited notions of church and rediscover the power of gathering in ways that prioritize genuine connection, mutual support,
Right.
and the shared pursuit of spiritual growth.
So less about attending a service and more about actively participating in a community that nourishes our souls and inspires us to live more fully into our faith.
Precisely, it's about recognizing that faith is not a spectator sport,
Right.
but a lived experience that thrives on the fertile ground of authentic relationships and shared purpose.
This deep dive has been a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound discoveries come from questioning our assumptions and exploring the unexpected connections that lie beneath the surface of history. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and may your own gatherings be filled with the spirit of edification and growth.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking those deeper connections that enrich our understanding and inspire us to live more meaningful lives.
Blessed is the one who subscribes to this YouTube channel. Remember the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated.